At 24,000 feet above Europe, where the air is so thin it can kill a man in minutes and the cold can shatter steel, an American B-17 Flying Fortress was already dying. Its aluminum skin was torn open. One engine was gone, another was on fire, and the tail had nearly been ripped away by German cannon shells. Black smoke streamed behind it like a funeral banner in the sky. To the Luftwaffe pilots circling nearby, this bomber was finished. They had cut it in half, practically ripped its spine apart. Gravity was about to do the rest. But inside that falling aircraft, one American gunner was still alive, still conscious and still fighting, as the B-17 began its uncontrolled plunge toward the earth. Spinning, breaking apart, and screaming through the clouds, he did something no one below, and no one above, could believe. He kept shooting all the way down. This is not a story about survival alone. It is a story about defiance at the very edge of death, about a man who refused to stop, fighting even when the sky itself was tearing him apart, about a moment in World War II so violent, so extreme, that even the enemy, who caused it, would later admit they had never seen anything like it. This is the story of the B-17 that was cut in half at 24,000 feet, and the gunner who never let go of his trigger. The mission began like hundreds of others. Before dawn, the airfield in eastern England was alive with noise, engines coughing to life, mechanics shouting over the roar, and the heavy smell of fuel hanging in the cold morning air. The men of the 8th Air Force moved across the tarmac like ghosts, wrapped in leather jackets and fleece-lined boots, their breath turning white as it left their mouths. They joked quietly, smoked cigarettes with shaking hands, and avoided looking too closely at the empty bunks of crews who hadn't come back from yesterday's mission. Everyone knew the numbers, everyone knew the odds, and everyone knew that once the wheels left the ground, luck mattered as much as skill. The B-17 was a legend, 4 engines, bristling with machine guns, designed to fly deep into enemy territory and bring destruction from above. But legends did not make men immortal. German flak did not care how famous your aircraft was. Neither did the Messerschmitts, and Focke-Wulfs waiting on the other side of the channel. The men climbing into that bomber knew exactly what could happen to them. They had seen planes come back riddled with holes. They had seen planes come back without crews. And they had seen planes not come back at all. The gunner took his position like he always did. The cramped metal compartment felt familiar now, cold, loud, and unforgiving. He checked his weapon by muscle memory, feeding the ammunition belt, testing the movement of the gun, listening to the comforting mechanical clicks that told him everything was ready. This was his world once the shooting started. No room to run, no room to hide, just a thin layer of metal between him and the sky and his finger on the triggers. The bomber formation lifted off and assembled in the gray morning sky. The engines settled into their steady thunder. England fell away beneath them, green fields turning into a patchwork of fog and coastline. Then the channel passed below, dark and cold, swallowing aircraft that went down without a trace. Ahead lay Europe, occupied, fortified, and waiting. Hours later, as the bombers pushed deeper inland, the first black bursts of flak appeared. At first they were distant, harmless-looking puffs, blooming far from the formation. Then they walked closer. Each explosion shook the aircraft, sending vibrations through the fuselage and into the bones of the crew. Shrapnel rattled against the metal skin like handfuls of gravel. Somewhere in the formation, a bomber took a direct hit and dropped out of line, spiraling downward in flames. No parachutes were seen. The intercom crackled with tense voices. Gunners called out directions. Pilots adjusted course. Everyone scanned the sky, knowing what came next. And then they saw them. Tiny black dots rising fast from below, growing larger by the second. German fighters. The hunters had arrived. The first attack came head-on, the most dangerous kind. Messerschmitts screamed straight at the formation, firing cannons that tore through aluminum like paper. The sky filled with tracer fire, red and white lines crossing in deadly patterns. The gunner tracked a fighter in his sights, squeezed the trigger, and felt the vibration of the gun hammer through his arms. He watched his rounds walk toward the enemy aircraft, saw flashes along its fuselage, and then it was gone, diving away as another fighter replaced it. The air was chaos now. Engines roared, guns thundered, and flak continued to burst all around them. The B-17 shuddered as rounds slammed into it. A loud bang echoed through the fuselage. One engine was hit. The bomber slowed slightly, falling just a fraction out of formation. That was all the Germans needed. They came again, this time from the side. Cannon shells ripped into the wing, fuel sprayed into the air, igniting in a brief flash of flame before the fire suppression system kicked in. The aircraft lurched violently. Warning lights flashed. The pilot fought the controls, struggling to keep the bomber level. Then came the hit that changed everything. A burst of 20mm cannon fire tore into the rear of the aircraft. Metal screamed as the tail section was shredded. Control cables snapped. The entire bomber twisted as if struck by a giant fist. Inside, men were thrown against walls and bulkheads. The intercom went dead in a burst of static. The gunner felt the aircraft begin to fall. Not a smooth descent, not a controlled dive, but a violent, sickening drop as gravity took over. Loose equipment flew through the air. The sound of the engines changed, rising into an uneven howl. Outside, pieces of the bomber were breaking away, spinning into the void. At 24,000 feet, the B-17 was no longer a bomber. It was wreckage. And yet, through the terror, through the chaos, through the certainty that this should have been the end, the gunner forced himself back into position. He could see fighters circling, waiting to finish the kill, waiting for the bomber to break apart completely, waiting for gravity to claim everyone inside. His hands were numb. The cold was brutal. The aircraft was spinning, the horizon flipping wildly in his vision. But the gun was still there, and as long as the gun was there, the fight wasn't over. He squeezed the trigger again. Tracer fire poured out of the shattered bomber as it fell, streaking upward toward the astonished German pilots. Even as the aircraft broke apart around him, even as the earth rushed closer with terrifying speed, the American gunner kept firing, refusing to surrender the sky, refusing to accept that this was how it ended. Far below, no one would believe what they were about to witness. And above him, the enemy realized they were watching something they would never forget. Sky turns into a grave. The B-17 was no longer flying. It was tumbling. At 24,000 feet, there is a moment when a falling aircraft seems to hang between worlds. Not yet claimed by the earth, not yet free of the sky. The bomber rolled onto its side, nose dipping. Tail shuddering violently as torn metal screamed in the slipstream. Air rushed through holes where steel and aluminum had once held firm. The temperature dropped instantly, the cold clawing at exposed skin, stealing breath, turning pain into something distant and unreal. Inside what remained of the fuselage, gravity shifted without warning, slamming men into ceilings, walls, and floors as the aircraft spun like a dying animal. The gunner's world shrank to noise and motion. The roar of wind drowned out everything else. His oxygen mask had been ripped away, leaving his lungs burning as he struggled for air that barely existed at that altitude. Each breath felt thinner than the last. Black spots crept into his vision, threatening to pull him into unconsciousness. But instinct, drilled into him by months of training and hours of combat, refused to let go. His body remembered what to do even as his mind reeled. He wrapped one arm around a twisted metal frame to anchor himself and dragged the gun back into position, with the other fighting both gravity and fear. Outside, German fighters circled cautiously. They had seen bombers go down before, hundreds of them, but this was different. The aircraft below them was already finished. Its formation was gone, its engines uneven, its structure visibly failing. Normally, this was the moment when a crew bailed out or vanished into the clouds in a final explosion. But instead of parachutes blooming in the sky, something else happened. Tracer fire suddenly erupted from the falling wreck, streaking upward in wild, defiant lines. The gunner's fire was erratic, uneven, but unmistakably a live one. Luftwaffe pilot later wrote that it felt wrong to attack it again. Not out of mercy. Mercy had no place in the air war, but out of disbelief. The bomber should have been dead. No one should have still been fighting inside it. And yet, every time a fighter edged closer, machine gun fire lashed out, forcing them to break away. The falling B-17 was not just crashing, it was resisting. Inside, the gunner's ears rang with the constant thunder of his weapon. The recoil jarred his already battered body, each burst sending pain through his shoulders and spine. He could not see the rest of the crew. He did not know who was alive, who was dead, or whether anyone else was still fighting. The intercom was silent. The aircraft answered nothing. In that moment, he was alone in a sky that wanted him dead, doing the only thing that still made sense, firing back. The bomber rolled again, this time more violently. A section of the fuselage tore free, vanishing in an instant. The wind became a physical force, slamming into him, trying to rip him out of his position. His fingers went numb, struggling to feel the trigger beneath his gloves. The world narrowed further, vision tunneling, thoughts slowing as oxygen deprivation took its toll. Training manuals warned that men at this altitude could lose consciousness in seconds without oxygen. But fear, adrenaline, and sheer stubborn will pushed him beyond those limits. Below them, the cloud layer rushed up fast. The ground was still invisible, hidden beneath gray and white. But the sense of speed was unmistakable. The bomber was accelerating, pulled harder and harder by gravity. Structural pieces continued to tear away, leaving jagged edges where smooth surfaces had been moments before. Each second felt like it might be the last. A German fighter made one final approach, perhaps out of habit, perhaps to put an end to the spectacle. As it closed in, the gunner swung his weapon, leading the target through shaking sights. He fired in short bursts, conserving what little control he still had. Tracer rounds arced toward the fighter, forcing it to jink away at the last moment. The pilot pulled up sharply, disappearing above the falling wreck. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the firing stopped. The gun fell silent, not because the gunner chose to stop, but because the aircraft finally reached the point where human effort no longer mattered. The B-17 hit the cloud layer like a hammer. Moisture exploded across broken windows and torn metal. Visibility vanished. The sky became a swirling gray tunnel, spinning faster, louder, colder. Inside that cloud, time fractured. Seconds stretched into something endless. The gunner's strength failed. His grip loosened. The roaring wind filled his ears, and the darkness at the edges of his vision closed in. The last thing he felt was weightlessness, the strange, floating sensation of a body no longer fully connected to the machine around it. When the bomber burst out of the clouds, the earth was suddenly there. Fields, forests, roads, villages. Too close, far too close. The remains of the B-17 struck the ground in a violent final explosion, tearing a crater into the European soil and scattering wreckage across the landscape. Smoke rose in a thick column, visible for miles. Flames consumed what little remained of the aircraft, erasing the last traces of the battle in the sky above. German soldiers reached the crash site expecting bodies. What they found instead would haunt them for years. The man who should have been dead. The smoke was still rising when the first German soldiers approached the crash site. The bomber had torn into the earth with such force that the ground itself seemed wounded. Blackened soil and twisted metal scattered across the field like the remains of a mechanical skeleton. Flames licked at fragments of wing and fuselage, popping ammunition cooking off in sharp, hollow cracks. The smell of burning fuel hung thick in the air, mixing with churned earth and scorched grass. This was a familiar sight in occupied Europe. Another American bomber brought down, another crew erased from the sky, or so it seemed. The soldiers advanced cautiously, rifles ready, more out of habit than necessity. No one survived crashes like this. Everyone knew that. At 24,000 feet, a falling bomber was a death sentence long before it ever touched the ground. Men either burned, froze, blacked out, or were torn apart before impact. That was the reality of the air war. There were rules to how death worked. And yet, as they moved closer, one of those rules was about to be broken. Among the wreckage, something stirred. At first, it was so subtle that no one trusted their eyes. A slight movement amid the twisted metal, a shape that did not belong to the wreck itself. A German soldier raised his rifle, heart pounding, convinced it must be a trick of smoke or flame. But then the shape moved again. A man. Broken, burned, bloodied beyond recognition, but unmistakably alive. The gunner had been thrown clear in the final moments, torn from what remained of the fuselage just before impact. It was the only reason he still breathed. His body lay twisted, his uniform shredded, skin torn and burned, bones shattered by the violence of the fall. His helmet was gone. His face was streaked with blood and ash. He should not have been alive. And yet his chest rose and fell in shallow, stubborn breaths. The Germans stood frozen. They had seen courage. They had seen fanatics. They had seen men cling to life in ways that defied logic. But this was different. This was the man they had watched, firing from a falling aircraft, the one who refused to stop, shooting even as his bomber was being torn apart. Now he lay before them, somehow still holding on to life, as if death itself had not yet managed to claim him. They did not shoot him. Instead, they called for medics. In the chaos of war, this decision stood out. Orders said enemy airmen were prisoners. Common sense said this one would not live long enough to matter. But something about the sight of him, broken, silent yet unyielding even now, stayed their hands. Perhaps it was respect. Perhaps it was disbelief. Perhaps it was the unspoken understanding among soldiers that what they had witnessed in the sky was not ordinary combat. The gunner drifted in and out of consciousness as he was moved. Pain came in waves so intense they erased thought entirely, followed by moments of cold emptiness where he felt nothing at all. Voices echoed around him in a language he barely recognized. Hands pressed against wounds. Darkness closed in, then lifted again. Through it all, his mind replayed the same image. The gun, the sky, the falling aircraft, the act of firing because stopping had never felt like an option. He woke days later in a German hospital. The ceiling above him was white, cracked, unfamiliar. His body was wrapped in bandages, suspended by slings and supports that held broken limbs in place. Every breath hurt. Every movement sent fire through his nerves. When he tried to speak, no sound came out. A nurse noticed his eyes open and froze, staring at him as if she had seen a ghost. Moments later, officers arrived, their expressions tight with disbelief. Word of his survival spread quickly. Pilots talked. Ground crews talked. Soldiers talked. The story changed with every telling, but the core remained the same. An American gunner had kept firing from a bomber that was already falling apart, and he had lived. Luftwaffe pilots who had attacked the B-17 confirmed it. They described tracer fire coming from a wreck that should have been nothing more than debris. Some admitted they had pulled away not out of fear, but because the sight unsettled them. War had rules, even if they were brutal ones. This had broken them. For the Germans, the gunner became a symbol of something dangerous, not just enemy strength, but enemy will. Machines could be destroyed. Formations could be shattered. Cities could be bombed into rubble. But the human capacity to resist, even when everything was lost, was far harder to defeat. For the gunner himself, recovery was a slow descent back into the world of the living. He learned piece by piece what had happened to the rest of his crew. Some had died instantly. Others had never been found. Their names were added to lists, their bunks reassigned. Their war ended in a few violent seconds over occupied Europe. Survivor's guilt settled in alongside the pain, heavier than any bandage or cast. And yet, as weeks passed, one truth became unavoidable. He was alive. Against altitude, gravity, flak, fighters, and physics itself, he had survived. Not because the aircraft saved him, not because of luck alone, but because, in the final moments, he had refused to accept the idea of defeat. He had fought when there was nothing left to fight from. The Germans would later return him in a prisoner exchange, broken in body but unbroken in spirit. Back home, his story would spread quietly at first, then louder. A tale told in training rooms, barracks, and reunion halls. Not as a legend meant to glorify war, but as a reminder of what a human being could endure. Because sometimes history is not shaped by victory or defeat. Sometimes it is shaped by the simple act of refusing to stop at 24,000 feet. Logic ends, machines fail, wings tear apart, and gravity always wins. But on that day over Europe, one man proved that the human will can fall farther than any aircraft, and still refused to break. The B-17 was destroyed. The mission was lost. Most of the crew never came home. Yet as the bomber fell from the sky, guns still fired. Not for victory, not for survival, but because surrender was never an option. History remembers battles. It remembers victories. But sometimes, it remembers a single man who kept fighting, even while falling to his death.